Greetings, family. This is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And I have with me Samantha Mallerson of the Haywood Burns Institute. Thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so first, let's talk about your work with the Burns Institute. So if you tell us what it is, what it does and all that.
Yeah, for sure. So the BI, we call it affectionately the BI. The Haywood Burns Institute is a racial justice organization, a national organization, but does a lot of local work through a national platform. And it was really started by, our mutual friend and colleague, James Bell, about 20 years ago. At a time when, as we know, doing racial justice work was not the thing to do, right? It was really kind of pioneered an effort to even get the type of support necessary to do. Like, really, it started out as a justice reform, a racial justice reform organization. But the beauty about BI really is, it really represents who James is, right? So you have the legal, genius of James and really driving kind of a legal platform to hold systems accountable. So you have the system side of the work that was very much anchored in the criminal justice sector. And then you have the organizer side of James, the community activist side, right? And so we have a network of organizations, Community Justice Network for Youth, which was really a grassroots movement to really see simultaneously that inside-outside type of strategy for making what we call now transformation, but back then was a reform agenda. And so really bridging together community and system folks in localities to come together and have some shared decision-making for coming up with alternative ways to serve people, and at that time to really focus on not criminalizing what we know is just youthful misbehavior, and really starting to have folks seriously consider how the application of justice has been one that has been very much about racialized social control and suppression.
So, what's interesting about that, as you just kind of alluded to, criminal justice reform is now very popular. It's something that is more mainstream for a variety of reasons that we'll probably get into. Mm-hmm. But if you could just start by, and a part of what's cool is that, BI has been, on this trajectory before it was mainstream and popular. Mm-hmm. So you all have a lens in terms of looking at the kind of arena of this work from its inception. So if you can just kind of say a little bit about your perspective on just criminal justice reform generally, and in doing that, tie in some of your own professional experience, because you've done work outside of Burns as well. So if you could tie in just some of your own professional experience with that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, and it's funny because we were just talking about this not too long ago. It's entering into this space at the time that we all did enter into the space, and when BI first started, this was the type of work that you had to be really prepared to go in the room and be the most hated person in the room, right? You had to just kind of weather that and take it. It was very much a data-driven conversation back then to ensure that everyone didn't lose their mind and feel like you're calling everybody racist, because you're truly looking at policies and practices that exist that we knew were we were overrepresented at every point of the system, right? So it was really being able to, at that time, we used to say, use the data to drive the discussion, to eliminate the emotion from the conversation, right? 20 years later, I can say it's shifted dramatically. I think now we're at the place where, at least at the BI, we're saying reform isn't enough. Working to reduce disparities isn't enough. Now we're at a point of saying, this needs to be a values-driven process. We'll still use data, both qualitative and quantitative, to advance the conversation, but anchoring it in a set of values, being values-driven, and really centering your humanity to see how we're able to get to a place that we don't believe justice will ever transform itself. It won't reform itself. It's going to take a cross-sector kind of stakeholder approach and community-driven practices to get to a place of true transformation, not even reform anymore. I want to say clearly, while we still honor the role that harm reduction plays, and we need to reduce the harm that these systems are currently having on children, families, and communities, But we need to get to a place of transformation. We need to radically imagine something that is completely different. And I think along that kind of spectrum of experience, as you said, was like really being able to be very clear with folks that no matter what your reform effort is, your jail reduction numbers, your strategies, if you're not anchoring it in a true like appreciation and understanding of the role that race and ethnicity plays in criminal justice, then you're never going to get there. You're not going to materialize what you're trying to do if you cannot anchor it in a racial justice framework.
And just one of the things you talked about, harm reduction. If you can just say a little bit more about what you mean by that and contrast that to when you talk about transformation.
Sure. So I think, harm reduction, and I want to say, like, it is important work. Like, that is, I don't want to minimize that. Harm reduction, in my mind, is the more of the typical reforms that we've seen over the last 20 years that have given us some marginal gains, right? We can use data, we can do systems mapping, we can identify where the disparities, where they exist and where they exacerbate. We can focus in there, change policies and practices, and we can absolutely reduce disparities. But to actually eliminate disparities, and that's where we're trying to go, is the difference for me. So the importance of using, policy and practice change within the current constructs that exist to reduce the amount of harm that justice has, particularly on communities of color, is important. But to get to a place where we will no longer see the harm at all means that we have to go far beyond that. And to almost think about justice for me is the part of our, like when you think about our whole human service continuum, right? Everything that we need as people, when everything else has failed, we have an entryway into justice, right? The justice sector will touch you somehow when all these other things have failed. And justice is also the most primitive system of all the other systems, right? And so in our mind, we have to actually have an approach to transform justice that then brings everybody into partnership from around justice. So sister agencies, organizations, communities coming together, really a community-centered approach to reform and transformation, but being able to almost starve the beast, right? So everybody kind of coming together in this way that then addresses the issues that are necessary, the more of the root causes, that eliminates the pipeline to even having the interaction with justice in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So as we talked about before, the mainstreaming of criminal justice reform, and you talked a little bit about this, but if you can say more about, because part of what I'm seeing, like the mainstreaming of criminal justice reform, I'm seeing it co-opted by, center, left, liberals, and conservatives. So to give you an example, there was a state senator who's resigned now, Senator Bobby Zirkin, who came out of the northern part of Baltimore County. And while he's a Democrat, he chaired the Judicial Proceedings Committee. And Maryland a few years ago made the move of decriminalizing less than 10 grams for possession of marijuana. And so I remember him testifying for this, and he talked about the racial disparities. And in talking about the racial disparities, he was talking about it from the perspective of this being a move in that direction. What's interesting about him, though, is that a few years later, I'm fighting him because he's advocating for mandatory minimums and sentence enhancements and stuff like that. And he would emphasize like nonviolent offenders, right? So to me, it was almost like the nonviolent offenders part took up so much space. It was a way for liberals to be able to say they're doing criminal justice reform, but do it in a way that actually doesn't address the fundamental aspect of white supremacy that's embedded in a lot of these systems. So for me, like that's one of the places where I see the mainstream criminal justice reform movement, being, problematic. What are some challenges when you look at the landscape around criminal justice reform? What are some of the things you're seeing in those mainstream spaces that it's important to push back on?
Yeah, it's a good question. And some of this even goes back, I think, and when we look back at when we started into where we are, I think it's interesting. I think one of the first things that we tend to lift up is you've got to let go of any preconceived notion you have of what is red or blue when it comes to justice reform. Like, that doesn't apply, right? And I think that a lot of people have a lot of assumptions about progressive agendas and what that means for justice reform that are just simply not true, right? And I can tell you, even in Baltimore, some of the, starting up some really great community-based alternatives here in the city, like the PAC Center is an alternative in Baltimore City for young people. All that was funded under Republican leadership at the time, right? Which is, I think people get very surprised by that. The idea is if there's Republican leadership, then there'll be nothing that happens, that's community-driven. And while those, in some cases that's true, but in some cases it's not. It is really checking the assumptions aside, because I think one of the things that we saw early on in criminal justice reform was that Republicans never had to come out with a tough on crime agenda because they're Republican. Everybody knows they're tough on crime. They don't need to lead with that. Democrats, on the other hand, may come out with like a really strong progressive agenda, but also equally strong on this tough on crime mentality. And like you said, that in and of itself, the way public safety is applied right now, then is a very intentional effort to criminalize and have surveillance for people of color, right? This is what it drives. And so we've definitely had to let go of any assumptions that we would have, any kind of leeway or additional support for having a community-driven justice platform or alternative type of support under a progressive leadership. It just doesn't exist. You got to get in it and really start, again, like using the same fundamentals, but using the data to drive the decisions, but really having community lead an effort that is identifying what great things can happen when they're community driven, such as alternatives, to detention. One thing I would say that I think is interesting, given the time we're in now, is like what we saw at the beginning of COVID to where we are, and we kind of sometimes refer to this as a bit of a rebound effect that's happening. What was interesting was, the initial reaction to COVID, we saw two different things happening in different places, right? You saw folks that were just kind of locked up and people were scared and didn't know how to come in and out in terms of staff even, like what the staffing structures would look like. And that was a kind of like terrible space for folks at that time, right? Being literally locked in with this virus at a time when we didn't know how deadly it was. There was a lot of assumptions. But what we also saw was suddenly these systems that usually take decades to move stuff, right? Like really granular movement around reform, like truly changing policy and practice. We saw overnight things change, right? Massive releases in some areas. Reducing populations down significantly in ways that we had never seen anything move this fast. Justice does not move quickly. We know that. But at this time, we did see that. And it was interesting to see that even with all those massive reductions at the time, there was no increase in crime. None, right? So it really should have led us to a different place of conversation around, okay, we can actually do this. All these low-level offenses or multiple... I'm talking 98% decreases in some cases, like very significant with no increase in crime. This was a moment that everyone should be paying close attention to try to ensure that we won't snap back, right? Which is what we're kind of seeing now. Like the pendulum has shifted, right? It's swinging back the other way. And now we have to pay attention and ensure that we don't go all the way back.
Mm-hmm. So I want to follow up on that. It's a bit of a deviation, but I think this is good. You and I were at a meeting the other day, the squeegee, for folks who are listening that aren't familiar, in Baltimore City, during the summertime, folks will, clean people's window with a squeegee. And there's been a bunch of...
Which they've been doing since the 80s.
Right. So it's been happening for a while. And, there was an unfortunate incident a few, weeks ago. Mm-hmm. White guy jumped out, swung a bat at a young brother. Brother came back with a gun, killed the gentleman. Mm-hmm. And so the mayor convened a task force, that we're on. And the reason why I'm bringing that up in the context of this, because that pendulum piece, I think, really important in capturing that. Because a part of what we're hearing From the business community, it's like they want, clear the corners, right? And in some context, like whatever the cost is. The folks that we were in conversation with at that table wouldn't say it with that level of directness. But I know just from conversations that folks in the business community that are like, just whatever it takes, lock them up, whatever it takes. And one of the things I always find interesting is even though there's this, again, criminal justice reform is a mainstream piece, the extent to which people misunderstand the way in which these approaches, these tough on crime measures, actually don't impact public safety in the way that people, would describe it to have. But then it drives the kind of policy that goes in the opposite direction of where we're trying to go. And what I find is that many of the progressive folks in the criminal justice, we've actually talked about this a lot on this podcast, do not do a good job of really debunking the argument. It's almost like it's taken for granted that those are racist policies, but really being able to, really combat, that drive from that kind of right-wing perspective, do it in a way that really can alleviate the concerns of people who would. So for someone who is susceptible to that kind of right-wing, we need to lock them up, it's getting out of hand. And I would assume you would use some of what you just said. Like, what would be, how would you effectively, push back against that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's whenever there is a tragic incident, and we as people just have to be prepared for it. Every now and then we're going to have a tragedy, right? I think that's part of human nature, unfortunately. But the most important thing to do when there is a tragedy is to make sure that tragic incident doesn't set us back 20 years in terms of policy and practice, right? Which is the knee-jerk reaction. That's what you see, right? Oh, wait, no, we have to clean them up. And there was a time where it was nothing to have street sweeps in Baltimore. If they bring a van, everyone's locked up that day, right? I think the worry is in those moments of heightened concern, and I want to be clear too, I don't always know that the concern is really with the people as much as it is as maybe somebody worried about not being reelected in a moment of having a response, right? So we have to parse that out too. But it's to not forget that we have all of the information we need around what works, right? We know we cannot arrest our way out of a problem. You can't arrest your way out of poverty, right? Blanket curfews across cities, that's essentially like extending your jail to a neighborhood, right? Those things don't work. We know what works. We know that having, programs and opportunities, having communities with infrastructure that are able to support and invest, these are the types of things that we need to continue pursuing. And it is a bit of a longer game, right? But we have to stay focused on that. That longer game will get us to where we need to be by addressing some of the root causes that we know create these types of incidences that happen. The knee-jerk reaction policy, the sweep them up, the lock them up mentalities, that will set us back so far. And the city won't be prepared to rectify that, right? Once you're back there, you're back there. I think keeping folks really focused and accountable to doing what works in community rather than reacting to something in a moment that is going to further marginalize communities and increase what is already a problematic issue.
So let's, in a bit of a shift, but a part of why I wanted to go deep there, one of the other things that's become mainstream is this, language around abolition, right? And I think, as someone for whom, I did, for people familiar with my work, I did policy debate in college. And in fact, one of the first arguments that we ran was abolish prisons. Angela Davis, our prison's obsolete, right? So, being very familiar with the argument, the perspective, critical resistance, and all that work that emerges. And so, a lot of times when I'm seeing the conversations about abolition, and while I understand the importance of understanding that this society uses the technology of incarceration as a fundamental aspect of how white supremacy is perpetuated in society, criminalization, all those things. One of the things that, again, that we've talked about on this podcast is two things. One, that the way that abolition is discussed, I think in many contexts, doesn't take in consideration the real reality of gun violence in the community, right? And that in order to have working class black people buy into whatever set of policies, one needs to address themselves to the immediate circumstances. And a lot of our people just aren't at a place of abolition, right? They just aren't there. So that's one. And then secondly, in terms of when I think about abolition, I think about many of the non-Western, ancient African, contemporary African, indigenous societies that had much more humane ways of dealing with people that I don't see referenced enough in the literature around abolition. And so I find myself in this weird place because, again, on one hand, I get it and believe ultimately we want to abolish these systems. On the other hand, I just find limitations in the way that it's been perpetuated in the mainstream. So not the idea of abolition itself, but the way that it's been mainstream. What are your thoughts on all that?
Oh man, there's so much to what you just said. Like,
okay.
I can take this in so many directions. Just on the word alone, let's just say, because I think there are, I just have I just have such a pet peeve for like what becomes the word of the day, the buzzwords, right? And so it's co-creation, co-design, it's centering community, it's abolition, right? It's these things that almost, sometimes you think it's great when something picks up enough momentum that it's out there, and then sometimes you see the real challenges that is created when something is picked up and used by folks that may not fully understand what it means, right? And then the challenges that creates. Abolition has been an interesting one, and I'll tell you because I think that this notion of abolition has been now, I feel, used to almost add to the kind of constant political polarization of movements and ideologies, right? And so much so in a way that is almost like divided before we're even united to move it forward. I think about, abolition in the context of let me try to find an articulate way to say this, not to present it as an either or, right? Because I feel like what is at the heart of the conversation sometimes becomes the either or. So things that folks never had even made a partisan issue, when you throw the word abolition on it, now it's suddenly a partisan issue, right? Even things in child welfare where, folks just want to save kids. Let's not even, but you know what I mean? So that's where they're going to go with it. I try to think about abolition in the context of if we're all going in the same direction, right? Let's all get on this train. This is where we're going. We're going to go to we know we want to be in a different place, right? We want the systems to look completely different. So we're on this ride. For me, I don't necessarily care if you get off 3 stops from now or 10 stops from now. I know the end is abolition, right? For me, let's get everybody on the train, let's move, let's coordinate, let's strategize together, understanding some folks are gonna get off early, right? Right now, I feel folks that know the train is going to abolition, they're now hesitant to even get on the train, right? And I'm trying to get us in a place where we'll say, no, come on, even if you're doing, the more traditional reform. That's how I see your first few stops on that train, you're gonna get off, right? That's fine, come on along for these first few stops. We could use the help, right? It's gonna take all of us to move this the way it needs to move, but I definitely see right now that certain key phrases that are really anchored in something that I think a lot of us are driving towards are creating, once it's taken out of context and blown up a little too much, it gets taken in a way that is used to divide us, which is, again, part of the evil genius of white supremacy culture, right? Let's twist the word a little bit and get them to fight amongst themselves so we can take this to completion, right? I think that's just another example.
So from where you sit, you're saying you see that in real time, like this dynamic you're describing.
Absolutely.
You're seeing that in real time.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because a part of why I emphasize that particular part, because there's the conversation around the policy, the ideology, but then there's like how it's actually being practiced and the advocacy on it.
Yeah.
And that's another thing. Like I often find that in terms of what it takes to move policy, there are ways in which the discussion of ideology can be overly exhaustive and not empty into actually moving policy. I don't know, in Baltimore and in Maryland, I don't see it as a big impediment because I think, quite frankly, the kind of networks that have kind of pushed abolition to the mainstream aren't as present here, both in Baltimore and the state of Maryland in terms of policy, but in terms of the national discourse, where you probably have a much better seat, you're saying you're seeing that like firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, even on issues that traditionally have been kind of, there's been a lot more momentum to move something forward. Yeah, once folks started talking about it's interesting. Abolition was usually only used in the context of criminal justice, right? Like that was usually the only place we heard it. And there are always folks that are going to, kind of immediately go against the grain when they hear that. It's scary to them. Which is why defund the police got so much, attention. But even to hear it on the child welfare side now, it's just interesting, right, that this term abolition comes up. And I think it's like thinking about it in terms of, and I think this has always kind of been at play, like what role does that particular system of oppression play when it comes to people's economic development plans, right? And examining the correlation between. So I think you have a lot of good folks that want to do reform to a certain extent, but once we talk about transformation in a real way, that maybe folks will shift and think about job elimination, which sure will be a part of that. But they lose sight of, if we're transforming into something else, there'll be a whole bunch of different types of job creation that would be great job. So I feel like it's folks don't see it all the way through. It's almost as if you imagine you get to that end of the road and then suddenly they think it's a drop off, and not realizing like while we're deconstructing in one sense, there's teams of us out here that are also rebuilding at the same time, right? And so just thinking about how that works simultaneously and getting folks to understand there's going to be a new reality by the time we get there, one that we get to shape and define together, that just by that in and of itself we know will be better.
So that's a good segue. So, one of the things I've become familiar with is BI, structural well-being framework. And to the very last point you just made, I think one of the things that's very important in doing this work is to go beyond the deconstruction and be able to really, think and practice what it means to build the alternative. And for me, that's one of the places, like when I think about, folks who are familiar with LBS's work, we're pretty explicit in terms of our perspective, Pan-African nationalists, in terms of our perspective and methodology. And to me, what a part of why ideologically so committed to that is because the emphasis is on building the thing that replaces what we have. And I feel like structural well-being is a very good framework for thinking about how to build those alternatives. So you can talk about structural well-being and Burns' work around that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's just like you said, as we think about deconstructing structural racism, when we all really understand the role it plays just in the cultural fabric of our society, we know then if we eliminate it, we need to replace it with something, right? And so we use the term structural well-being really intentionally because we imagine right, so if we can deconstruct successfully and we rebuild and have what we need, and I don't want folks to get lost in the term, but because I say this a lot and I know I do get some critique for it, there really is like an evil genius to structural racism, right? There really is. And so it's like eliminating this now and forgetting the evil, but using the same genius to kind of build something so interwoven that it is anchoring our society in a way that everywhere you turn within institutional policies, practices, cultural norms, the way of being and belonging, all this is actually then working towards our well-being, right? What does that look like to have that almost that massive kind of core safety net that everywhere we turn, there's this sense of appreciation, belonging, just really having what we need to thrive. And so we really think about strengthening and establishing all the norms necessary to hold at the core of our now like cultural fabric, this sense of I have what I need to thrive.
Mm-hmm. So if you can ground that in some examples of some work that BI has done. I know, there are certain places that have actually tried to come in and really essentially build some of those alternatives. So you can ground that in like some examples of.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that most recently, again, like this is, in the trajectory of our work, starting out primarily focusing on justice and even being a bridge to have justice and community at the table together. A structural well-being framework is about like eliminating the possibility of justice, like the justice system, right? And so this is definitely like a cross-sector approach. And so we really look to work in places, and we know, let's just say like all these initiatives, all the justice sectors in the country really operate at a local level, right? We know real work happens at the local level. So we tend to work with collaboratives that come together that are cross-system stakeholders and very much community presence to ensure that there is a values-driven process. And it's funny because sometimes folks will think like, oh, values-driven, what does that mean? But it's actually like really profound when you have stakeholders who typically don't engage together at all. You have amazing community organizers who know and are of community coming to the table with, a cross-sector approach of human services providers that may or may not have connections to community, right? And may or may not have connections to each other, right? We know how this stuff works in these operational silos. So we've had a few places that have really come together and established a very good cross-sector of community collaboratives that come together to engage in this work. And when you have folks come together and identify like what are the values that we share that are going to drive this process, it's such a different conversation than when you're looking at the outcomes that drive your agency, right? The outcomes that are driving your funding sources, the outcomes that are, instead you're at a place of saying like, no, this is going to be the values that hold us together as people, the things that I want for my children, the things that you want for yours. We're going to come together and allow that to drive the work that we do together is a very different thing. And it may sound simplistic, but it really, that's for us, we believe like those are the seeds of transformation when you have folks come together in that way. And we do have a few communities that are doing some stuff that we consider to be very much on the cutting edge and certainly are seeds of transformation, right? We work with a group in Ramsey County who've done some, in Minnesota, who've been doing some really incredible work from changing the structure of their governments that were spread out very wide with multiple offices that we know make it very hard to respond to a human service need because it's so siloed. And so it's like dividing up an issue of a person rather than collectively being able to respond to a person's need. So they've reduced numbers of offices and collapsed things in ways that they could move resources much more flexibly and in response to what the community need was. So we've seen that type of infrastructure change. And I'm talking like from 40 to 12 or 7, like really becoming nimble in a way that could be more responsive to then creating transforming systems together, which is a community-driven and shared decision-making table for system responses to human needs. So you also have that as an initiative that is up and running and staffing and creating real opportunities for community co-design and creation and really shared decision-making. So that's happening, as well as some of the great work that has come out of Ramsey was even with the DA and choosing to, after what he names as a real turning point for him when with the loss of Philando Castile, he he will no longer charge pretextual stops, right? Which is huge. Like, that is a huge decision for a state attorney's office to do something like that.
For people who don't know, pretextual stops.
These were the types of stops like that ended up in a lot of the deaths that we've seen of Black men being what it may be a tail light, right? Like something that is not a reason to really engage that has resulted in really horrific endings of people's lives. So no longer charging that. So it gives you no right now to stop them for that, right? So like really being able to address those. But at the real essence of that have been like folks not afraid to reimagine something different, right? And so when you have all these different stakeholders coming together that also then can provide support for each other when they're making these pivots and need to make sure that kind of the political will begins to adapt and adjust to it. So it's been a combination of seeing a lot of really fruitful things developing there. Some of the work, that we're doing in LA is working to eliminate probation for young people, right? They're going to leave the Office of Probation and create a Department of Youth Development. I mean, that's transformational, right? And working through the operationalizing of that is a lot of work, and it's huge. Like, LA is huge. But that's the type of stuff, like, we weren't hearing stuff like that before. There's a real appetite in some places to really try something different, and folks that aren't afraid to really go into a process not knowing what the end looks like. And I think that's the biggest thing for us is, a lot of times folks will come in and say, hey, help us. We want to eliminate the disparities in this thing over here. Just show us the roadmap. We're going to go there. And we try to remind folks, like, you got to be in this and willing to engage in a process that you're not going to know which step you're taking for it. Like, you're going to be in this designing it as you go with folks that are going to be shaping it with you. You're going to give up the power that you may have in your particular office in a space of transparency, right, and power sharing, that you can't determine what that end road looks like. And we love to tell people all the time, we wish we had a perfect roadmap that said, do this, do this, do this, and you're going to have, racial equity and harmony at the end. Like, that, we haven't been there before, right? So that path is going to look a little different, I think, in every place. But I do think there are some places that are really leaning into this process in a real way. It's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And then, so lastly, one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about, the human social service sector, which is a place where, while, as we talked about, like the criminal justice system and all the ways that, as you described, being the most primitive, really looking at the way in which other human services and social programs perpetuate white supremacy and actually do harm. Mm-hmm. And that's a concept that I know, in a lot of spaces that I'm in, can be bewildering. Mm-hmm. Because the easy alternative is, cut here and then just give to programs, right? Mm-hmm. Give to, these agencies. Mm-hmm. And so if you could say a little bit just about, because I think folks who are familiar with this podcast, have read some of our work and seen some of our discussion on this. But if you could talk a little bit about the importance of making that point, like the importance of raising that these systems that are tasked with supposed to be helping our community, child welfare, public education, and other kind of social programs, why the importance of discussing the harm that those systems do.
Yeah, I mean, this is our discussion the other day at that meeting about history, right? And how much people know about the history of some of these human services, and particularly child service systems, the origins of those, right? And it is important to understand how things are or were created to really give folks a sense of why we are where we are today, and to really demyth some of these ideas that, oh, well, some folks, they're lazy or they're not working, and like eliminate that, right? I think, I think it's an interesting frame to think about in the healthcare system, where they started discussing like the social determinants of health, right? That was a transformational conversation. And I'll tell you why. I felt like health is a sector who had not traditionally really taken a deep dive into structural racism. By talking about social determinants of health, I felt opened the door for really having a conversation about the roots of structural racism in the current, like, modern day context of that, without even really saying it that way, without even naming race, right? Which was kind of crazy to see happen at the time. And so, when you think about it in our context and how we think about racial justice, I tend to think about, like, we say this at the BI a lot, like the social determinants of justice, right? And it's like, what are all the things that are working to put some folks on a pathway or trajectory to some pretty good outcomes, right? Or at least a chance at those, and then kind of facilitating others in a path that is towards these systems, the system contact, right? And again, like, the only way to truly get to those issues is never through programmatic application, right? The program may help you with one thing, but unless we're addressing the root cause of why you're there in the first place, it's almost like a Band-Aid approach, right? And when you put all the human services together, imagine 3 people holding a Band-Aid against a hemorrhage that's happening, right? It's just never going to be sufficient. So yeah, I think it's like understanding that, even the face of juvenile crime, when it started, right, when juvenile justice system even started to come together. I even hate to use the word juvenile, we use youth justice. But when it started, it was the face of a young white girl, right? And folks wanted to, hey, let's help this child, It looked very different back then. And even back then, we should say, though, even back then when these systems were being created, there was still, like, the kind of the father of probation, John Augustus, I think is his name. Lord knows they'll get me at BI if I mess that up. But he was a shoemaker. He was a community member. He just thought, oh, these kids shouldn't really be touching up against the system. Let's create something over here that's in community, right? Again, just showing you, even at the origins of the systems, when they were not designed for people of color at all, there was still always this emphasis of community kind of knew which was the better response, right? Like, so let's name that, because that's a through line that we all need to pay attention to as well. But there were lots of things that were coming together in those times that just by rights of who they determined to be qualified to accept service did not include people of color. The indigenous groups were not accepted. Black people were not considered. Immigration flux, and we've seen the degree, how many degrees of separation from blackness are you in this immigration flood that then you connect to this or you don't. There are all these trends, right? I think one of the most significant, in my opinion, though, is probably the use of family separation as a very tactical approach to really destroy communities, right? And so when you look back and you think about the indigenous boarding schools, and how much they said it was, what was it, the kill the Indian, save the man, right? And people talk about the cultural genocide, but this was like a true attempt at genocide, not just cultural, like these are people, right? Significant numbers of people being killed, land being stolen, right? When you think about the damage and the multi-generational impact of that family separation and the toll it took on the indigenous community, when you compare that to also like the transatlantic slave trade and what we saw in terms of family separation, the selling of children, this slave labor, right? The families being ripped apart, the multi-generational impact that has. Like, we know this stuff, right? When you look at the Japanese internment camps, when you look at most recently the work at enforcing the laws at the border that was having a disproportionate impact on the Latinx community, right? You see all these things, and it's amazing that when you actually pause and look at this and say across all these massive spans of time, across very distinct cultures, different languages spoken, right? Different cultural norms within each, the impact that has had has actually been the exact same, right? That multi-generational, deeply wounding impact that it has had on families, communities, and cultures. And to not sit back and say, wow, when you think about the two child-serving systems that have so many resources and attention, one seen as, punitive or to rehabilitate the child in justice, the other is another to save the child. Both use tactics of family separation, right? And we would be totally remiss to not identify that and connect it to the origins of that practice and the harms that we still haven't been able to correct today, right? And so when we think about that on a larger trajectory, we know that to reimagine something different needs to completely let go of this idea that we have that the systems as they are somehow going to start producing better outcomes. The outcomes that we see for kids of color in child welfare and youth justice are horrendous. There are no success rates, right? We see aging out populations, disproportionately kids of color, not having what they need as they move beyond or age out of these systems, right? And it's, when you think about if you were looking for a healthcare provider or a doctor and I told you, oh, go to this guy, he's great, like this doctor, he's 98% of the patients have died, but don't worry, go see them. Would you go? No. But our kids are touching these systems, right? And we need to really have a strong reality check on what we consider to be the type of reimagining that needs to happen to get us something really different.
Cool. All right. Well, appreciate you spending your time with us and in Search of Black Power. Thanks for coming on with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right.